which is the reduction of all forms of knowledge to the scientific form, which gives us another binary option. Either it's scientific or it's nonsense. Either it's understandable through the scientific method or it's just fantasy. What's scientific method? Observe empirically, form hypotheses, conduct experiments, draw conclusions. Good method? Yep, absolutely. When it comes to analyzing the empirical world. But I tell my interlocutors on YouTube all the time, man, there are so many questions that you cannot adjudicate through that method. Even though that method is wonderful in its proper place. But what's it all about? What's the meaning of my life? What makes an action right or wrong? What makes a city just or unjust? Why is there something rather than nothing? Those are very cool questions, very interesting questions, and they cannot be adjudicated through the sciences. Now, what happens though to a lot of people is, those questions simply get bracketed. They're just, who knows, uninteresting. They're just frivolous, trivial. One thing I've noticed through YouTube is something Cardinal George has said. He said, philosophy has largely disappeared as a mediating discipline. It's an interesting comment. We tend to think of another binary option, science and religion, right? The battle of science and religion. But there's a mediating discipline, namely philosophy. Philosophy is a way of knowing that prepares us in many ways for theology, for religion. All the questions I mentioned, those are properly philosophical questions. Now, are they addressed rationally by very serious people? Yes, indeed. People like Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, and Heidegger, right? These are not people who trade in nonsense. These are not irrational people. But they're engaging in a type of rational discourse that is not reducible to the sciences. I think the loss of this has led to all kinds of mischief and all kinds of trouble. And people aren't able to see religion as making a rational case, even though it's not making a scientific case. Here's a good example, by the way. I did a little YouTube on this. Do you see Stephen Hawking's remark when, the most famous scientist in the world said, there's no need for God because the universe can just kind of burp itself into being out of nothing. Remember that? Well, I read the remark and I thought, it is so incoherent philosophically. So I did a little, response to it. Well, then Scientific American called me up and said, we'd like to do a little, dialogue about this. And so we're talking. He said, I think what Dr. Hawking meant was that there's this primordial fluctuating vacuum that's full of potential energy, and it's actually got spatial extension, and it's from that vacuum that the universe comes to be. You know what I said to him? Why in the world would you call it nothing? Here's a big thing. It's got spatial, it's got energy, it's got potentiality. Why in the world would you call that nothing? See, the problem is, philosophically speaking, nothing means non-being. So when you say, the universe can just burp itself into being out of absolute nothingness, it's philosophically incoherent. The trouble is, we're trying to put too much weight on science. Science cannot adjudicate the question, why is there something rather than nothing? It just can't. Because the sciences follow that method I described that looks at things within the empirical universe. It cannot answer questions of ultimacy. But the problem is the scientistic reductionism leads to the bracketing of all those questions as unimportant or irrational. See, that's what we got to work on. That's the block. Now, here's another dimension of it. I see this every day practically on YouTube. Every day. Everyone out there believes the largely 19th century generated myth that the sciences emerged out of a desperate struggle with religion. Right? Everyone believes that. But that was largely invented in the 19th century. I was in Rome last spring as a scholar in residence there, and if you go to the Campo dei Fiori, the beautiful market area in Rome, there's a famous statue of Giordano Bruno, who was a Dominican friar but said all kinds of wild things, and he was burned at the stake in the year 1600. And there's this kind of beautiful brooding statue of him standing there with his Dominican hood up, And it's a rallying point for science and for reason over and against religion. Religion that put him to death. Of course, who's the patron saint of this view? Galileo. Constantly I hear Galileo. Every day, Galileo. his struggling to emerge out of the clutches of obscurantist, superstitious religion. Well, what do we say to this? I argue on the contrary. The condition for the possibility of the emergence of the sciences where they did, that is to say in the Christian West, was Christianity. Was the thought world, the matrix of Christian thought. It is not accidental that the modern physical sciences emerged when and where they did. They didn't emerge in Africa or the Far East or in Latin America. They emerged precisely out of a Christian matrix. How come? How come? Here's an argument I got from Peter Hodgson, who's a British scientist and theologian. He said two things are required for the emergence of the sciences. First of all, a keen conception that the world is not divine. If you think the world is divine, and of course a lot of people do, they worship the world, they honor nature, they honor the spirits within nature. See, as long as you have that view, you're not going to experiment on nature, you're not going to analyze it, cut it up, you're going to worship it. You think that's an old, outdated thing? Go see Avatar sometime. You see Avatar? The worship of nature. Go watch the Star Wars movies again, right? The Force. What's the Force? But the energy that runs through all living things, connects them all together. See, well, what is that but a worship of nature? A condition for the possibility of science is the clear sense that the world is not divine. Therefore, I can analyze it, experiment on it. Second thing, I've already hinted at it, the keen sense that the world in its entirety is intelligible. If I'm not convinced the world is intelligible, I will not get a science off the ground. This is Peter Hodgson now, where do both of these views come from? They come from the doctrine of creation. If the world has been created by God, it's not God. It's other than God, right? Good, excellent, beautiful, yes, but not God, right? Secondly, if the world's been created, it's intelligible, because in the beginning was the Word, and all things came to be through the Word. Therefore, those two things, theological ideas, had to be in place for the sciences to emerge.